Veganism is worse in every way, but probably not for the reasons that you would think. Now, the whole carnivore space obviously says that animals, more animals are killed with the whole veganism thing, and then the vegans say, no, we're saving animals because we're not eating them, and then they are both disputing. But I think veganism is worse not necessarily because of that reason, but because of the future implications of it specifically, as in it doesn't exist in the future. And I'll be explaining why. Now, instead of answering that question with science that is disputed, we're going to answer that question with science that isn't disputed and is overall, I think, decently well known. And it's taught in schools almost all the time, or at least it was taught in my school back in the day. And that comes down to ecology. Now, first, we have to ask a couple questions. We have to ask, what are the purpose of plants? What are the purpose of herbivores? What are the purpose of carnivores? How did life on Earth evolve? And is agriculture sustainable for human existence? Those are the only 5 questions that we have to ask in order to understand this. And I'll be explaining it in more detail, and you'll get to see why exactly veganism is so unsustainable, and in fact is not only damaging to the planet and us, the soil specifically, it's also damaging to all the animals that they're trying to save. Now, we're going to keep it simple, and we're not going to go into too much detail into all of these. We can go into far greater detail, but we're going to keep it very, very simple. And we're going to talk about, first, what is the purpose of plants? Well, the purpose of plants, to keep it simple for the most part, is providing oxygen. That's the purpose of plants. Next, we're going to ask the question, what is the purpose of herbivores? The purpose of herbivores is to basically spread the seeds, clear the vegetation, and fertilize the soil. Now, why exactly is that really important? Well, the spreading the seeds is a little bit important, but the clearing the vegetation is very important. And the reason that's important is because that prevents wildfires. And what's the purpose of fertilizing the soil? Well, that's really important because that helps the plants survive. The next part is, well, what if there's too many herbivores? Obviously, the question comes, what's the purpose of carnivores? Well, the purpose of carnivores is to keep the herbivores in check. That's basically it. So the whole purpose of the carnivores is specifically to make sure that the herbivores don't overeat on the plants, overclear the vegetation, and if they do end up overclearing the vegetation, what happens? Well, they end up dying because everything ends up dying. And they clear too much. It's a really good example of this is the tragedy of the commons, even though it's completely unrelated. Tragedy of the commons is a very, very good example of this. It's the exact same scenario. Too much overgrazing, what happens? Everybody ends up losing. And the next question we have to ask is, how did life on Earth evolve? It's basically rock, paper, scissors. Rock beats scissors, scissors beats paper, paper beats rock. Now, the thing about that is it's almost like a checks and balances system at the same time too. Just like the government, how the government functions. With the judicial, executive, and legislative branch, if any one of these has too much power, then the system ends up slowly collapsing or ends up falling apart. Sort of like the world we live in today, sadly, but that's the way it is. A lot of things are slowly falling apart because there's too much power in one of these specifically. And that brings us to our next and final question. Is agriculture sustainable for humans? This is where the answer is no. Why though? The answer is that agriculture causes the desertification of lands. And the way it does that is the animals, specifically herbivores, are not able to fertilize the soil. And on top of that, they're not able to basically put the nutrients back into the soil in the first place. And the plants basically keep draining the nutrients. So it's sort of like the carbon cycle, I guess you could say, where there's carbon up and carbon down. There's an equal carbon up, equal carbon down. Well, in this case, there isn't because there's no equal carbon down, specifically because the herbivores aren't actually being allowed to do their job. So that's the reason on that end. But that's not even including the herbicides and pesticides as to why agriculture is bad. There's plenty of other reasons, but just to keep it very simple from an ecological perspective, those 2 reasons itself are really, really bad. In fact, the inverse could happen as well. The inverse of that could happen is they could say, oh, let's just have cows and let's only use cows instead, and just have cows and grass, let the cows eat on the grass. Well, that is possible if they keep it in check. If they keep it in check and they make sure there aren't too many cows, basically, and there aren't too many humans, also, which is another problem. Keeping the herbivores, the carnivores, and the plants in check, then what ends up happening? Well, the cows end up overgrazing, and then suddenly we don't have any more cows to eat because that cows are all dead because they can't eat the plants and we can't eat the cows and we're not eating grass. Like, we're not eating shreds of grass. It's not going to happen. So the answer to the question of how do we keep it sustainable is to do exactly what happened in nature before. It's not agriculture, really. It's not agriculture. All it is to let the cycle go back to what it used to be. Herbivores consume the plants, carnivores consume the herbivores, and plants just grow because they don't really need much. All they need is CO2 and water. So, yeah, and sunlight. Well, and yet again, if we end up adding agriculture to the mix, we end up throwing off the balance of power. If we end up adding herbivores to the mix and we don't eat them, then we're throwing off the balance of power. If we add herbivores to the mix and we eat them too much of them, and we don't keep our population specifically a little bit regulated, then again, we have problems. The entire thing is just a balance of power. We have, as humanity at this point, which is really, really amazing thing to be honest, we have the power and we have the ability to balance all of this. The question is, can we limit our desires in order to balance and really keep ourselves alive? Not just ourselves alive, but all the herbivores, all the plants that you want to save, all the animals that you want to save, all the carnivores that you want to save, I don't care. They all rely on each other. And giving too much power to one of them, it's no different than giving too much power to one part of government. Basically ends up becoming a dictatorship. And dictatorships do not have a good ending.